Hello, my name is Kimberly Dawn Miller. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Global and Social Cultural Studies at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I have a background in African and African diaspora studies, as well as gender studies and history. So I'm really excited to get into this discussion specifically on the Caribbean, which is my research focus.
That's kind of where I want to kick it off historically with the analysis of Dominica. So the 1975 hurricane and the way that this relates to disaster management, foreign aid in particular as a tool of neocolonialism, the US kind of role in promoting this American neocolonialism with foreign aid after the hurricane, and then how this ties into Cold War politics with Dominica's relationship with Cuba, and the Cold War politics of aid.
Absolutely. So the 1975, I believe, was Hurricane David that struck Dominica. It actually, really devastated the island. And at that time, you had volunteers that come in. They came from Venezuela, they came from Cuba, they came from Grenada to kind of help in terms of that, relief process. Then the US also did, but it was in the ways in which they tried to condition and leverage US aid to make sure that the Dominican state did not have, the Dominican state did not have ties with Cuba. So Cuba's revolutionary government, it was seen as a pariah for the United States, this kind of independent move towards socialism. And in Dominica, socialism was also gaining traction. It was absolutely, there were Marxist-Leninists, particularly Rosie Douglas. He was trained as a Marxist-Leninist. He played a large role within the left of the Dominican state, as well as Dominican nationalism that was growing, Black power. So there are all these and Cuba was very much an inspiring force within the island. So it was interesting. I have this one quote where the agricultural minister, he wanted volunteerism to form Dominican work brigades in terms of the rescue workers. And he was actually condemned as a godless communist, just for saying that, just for wanting to have Dominicans be kind of the force that doesn't have to rely on this Western aid model, because they knew it was going to be used to undermine their sovereignty. So the ways, and it was so much of the Dominican Freedom Party in particular that was getting backed by the US government, giving aid to kind of push this narrative that no, Dominicans don't want to be under the boot of Cuba or the Soviet Union. So there was very much a Cold War climate in terms of how aid was being leveraged. And we see this as well in the 21st century, with Dominica in particular, that was very much decimated by Hurricane Maria in 2017, and the ways in which right now Dominica is in the Labor Party of Roosevelt Skerritt, who did, to his credit, try to create a path of autonomy within this IMF framework for natural disaster relief management. So it was still within this framework of this neoliberal kind of global restructuring, and he kind of foresaw ways in which that he can kind of maybe leverage ties with Venezuela, the Maduro government in particular, as well as the People's Republic of China, as a kind of autonomous form of development, because the ways in which the West has leveraged aid and leveraged these restructuring programs are very much tied into, like you were saying, imperial dominance, hegemony, and neocolonialism.
In 1981, let's kind of talk a little bit about the US-backed efforts of basically intervening in Dominica and sending US-backed groups, US white supremacist groups, to take over Dominica, and kind of what were the politics of the island at the time, and also the Cold War politics that are at play at the time as well, with Grenada and the New Jewel movement, and always kind of Cuba in the background as well.
Okay, so this is actually a very strange story. It has a lot of twists, and I think it's important to contextualize it within this wider project of US asserting itself in terms of how it can leverage its own foreign policy objectives into these newly independent Caribbean islands. So that's always helpful for me to understand the kind of trajectory of events. So in 1980, interestingly enough, the US-backed Dominican Freedom Party was in office with Eugenia Charles. So she was elected, and at that time, it was very clear that she was anti-communist. But interestingly enough, given its geography, it's a couple islands above Grenada, that it was going to be essentially used by these Canadian and American neo-Nazi mercenaries as a launching ground to subvert and sabotage the government in Grenada. And they wanted to establish businesses, and they just wanted to, yeah, and their anti-communist fight. It was very strange. And the US government under Reagan tipped off the Dominican authorities to let them know that this coup operation was underway. So at this time, it essentially turned the Dominican foreign policy within the objectives of the United States government. And we saw this typified 2 years later during the, surprisingly, ironically, the Eastern Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which was a regional body that was established in the 70s to give the Eastern Caribbean islands more autonomy, at least how Maurice Bishop saw it, more autonomy against US imperialism. It actually leveraged, it was used to legitimize the US invasion of Grenada. And Eugenia Charles, which was the elected president of Dominica, actually sat at that, was the chairperson of that organization to approve that imperialist operation. So we're seeing the ways in which, the US can basically use the idea of national sovereignty against state counter-hegemonic revolutionary governments and movements that kind of go against its agenda. So that was a very surprising situation, especially given the left wing had been basically purged actually by Patrick John, who was apparently the one that was going to be reinstated, put back in office after this coup. He wasn't a communist. He made sure that there was no traces of communism in his governance, but he was a SOCDEM, if you will. So he was, I guess, the moderate wing of fascism, but he wanted to work with these right-wing forces to kind of topple this government. But he was still very much antagonistic toward Maurice Bishop. So you see the way the splintering of these kind of more left-wing forces and the ways in which the US can essentially turn states against one another and more further and so these divisions and destabilization efforts. So yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, the plot is it's incredibly weird and kind of complicated, and it implicates a lot of different figures, members of Congress and the governor of Texas, who apparently knew about the plan. But it's primarily these neo-Nazis and KKK members who are trying to go and take over the island. And I think, so we talked a little bit about it, and I think it's clear that there's some US intelligence involvement in some capacity in this operation. And that's definitely related to the politics of the time, with the using of Dominica as a base against Grenada. And I think it's kind of curious to think first that they would come up with such a ludicrous plot, and they would have all this strange involvement. And I have read more about it. I recommend anybody listening to read more about it. And because the guys are talking afterwards, and they're talking about apartheid South Africa being involved in this, and it's this extremely complicated plot going on. But it's very much, I think, related to the US desiring to take out any opposing government, like the New Jewel movement in Cuba, and kind of have control over the Caribbean in this way and prevent any kind of alternative from coming up. And I think, just to relate that to the next question, is to say with Dominica, I guess in your research and in looking at these other examples with tourism, but just in general with kind of the control over these islands by the US government, by neocolonialism, why is it so important to crush these alternatives for the United States and to prevent any alternative from coming to power in the Caribbean? And with kind of the alternative examples that we've talked a little bit about of those development models posed by CARICOM and the East Caribbean kind of unity that's coming out of this time, why is this so important to break for US neocolonialism, US imperialism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think it goes back to the question of what is sovereignty, what is national sovereignty, and what is so much of development even mean? And I think that for the Caribbean in particular, economic self-sufficiency was very much kind of going to be the envisioned goal, definitely amongst left-wing kind of, forces. They wanted to be able to Caribbean states engage with the global market on their terms. Outside of the weight of like crushing plantation economies that kind of dictate so much of essentially how they can navigate the world economy, and thinking about so much when it comes to Dominica, but other like banana producing islands, at the World Trade Organization laid a devastating blow in 1999 that kind of shifted their entire market for bananas at the whim of Bill Clinton. He could simply decide that the EU's model of trade isn't favorable to US corporations like Dole and Chiquita Banana, and they can exploit that, like the Central American workers, of course, to benefit US corporations. And it really devastated so many of these island economies that use, they're based on agricultural exports. So just the idea of being at the whim of another entity, of another power, and the ways in which so many of the radical elements that came out of the Black Power era and the independence era wanted to envision a way in which development could be kind of sustained autonomously. So I think that in terms of thinking about CARICOM and regional integration and like the history of the West Indian Federation, like there are all these kind of circumstances that made the pursuit of a strong kind of autonomous, like, anti-imperialist force, it made it a lot more difficult because of the ways in which, the neo-colonial realities of the history of the region. I mean, the kind of underdevelopment and the ways in which, what does viable nationalism look like in the context of trying to assert like a regional body that can really, exert its own, agenda and autonomy. So, yeah.
No, that's a great answer. And I think that kind of relates to, in thinking about this plot in the 1980s and thinking about, you have these guys literally, I think, admitting at one point that the CIA had approached them with this plot and requisitioning their boat for use and everything. And it has the make of a very thrilling kind of like over the top spy movie in some capacity. Like it's a ludicrous kind of story. But I think in some ways it also distracts from imperialism that's more quiet and, is taking place in the form of IMF structural adjustment and even tourism. Like if we're rethinking how we think of tourism and thinking of it in the context of finance imperialism, bring foreign currency to run these islands. And then in addition to that, something that happens in a very quiet manner, but super important, which we've talked a little bit about with climate change, and just to think about like the destruction of the environment in places like Dominica and in other islands in the Caribbean, because really, a big part of it is tourism and how it plays a role. It's hard to kind of like balance tourism with doing this kind of protection of the environment and ecology. So this ecotourism is sort of it's an interesting approach, and it's one that has to be taken in kind of a careful manner, because it can lead to some, I guess, dangerous consequences when you allow people to come in from all over the world and look at the environment and have to try and also urge them to protect it. So I guess this is like my next question is about how this relates to protecting the environment, because that's such a crucial part of sovereignty, right? Like protecting the environment of your nation and not allowing it to be spoiled by foreign companies or foreign actors. So how do these concepts relate? Like how does Dominica, for example, today try and protect its sovereignty while also, very much related to that, protecting its environment from tourism and still having to rely on this industry for its economy?
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great point in terms of thinking about how the tourism industry is a driver of climate change. So you have a region that's made incredibly vulnerable. Actually, the most impacted in terms of severity is the Caribbean, going to be in the next several decades by natural disasters. So there's a region that's dependent on tourism. Tourism plays a role in exacerbating climate change, and then they're made obviously more vulnerable by the severity of storms due to climate change. So it's this weird kind of contradictory element of kind of needing the same source of revenue that's like harming the region so much. And I think when it comes to Dominica, so much of what I heard when I was there doing preliminary research was focused on preserving the nature in terms of not allowing the type of development trajectories that tourist economies that you might see in Dominican Republic, for instance, where I think it was interesting. They said, oh, where are the white sand beaches, in Dominica? They could construct white sand beaches, but, that's not their natural topography. And, a lot of, I think there's some dissent around, going too far, what's too much, and trying to find a balance about, how they will approach and protect their very, very fragile ecosystem related to, of driving in of this like global market of tourism, because you can say ecotourism, green resilience tourism, nature tourism, that can also be co-opted. And I think that, when I look at specifically ecotourism, I kind of don't paint it as one thing because it depends on how it's being enacted. It depends on the vision of the government in terms of how they see that kind of development. And there's certainly ecotourism in Grenada, for instance, that there's still kind of, or ecotourism in Mexico. I mean, there's ecotourism development that's also occurring in states that do prioritize tourism, but they're still seeing this kind of erosion of autonomy of the natural environment because it's based off these market incentives. So as long as it's like green capitalism, essentially, because it's still within this framework of like global capital and how that in terms of prioritizes extraction, pollution. And I think that's one thing I look at is how specifically it will be developed in conservation and in a friendly kind of interaction with the host environment, because it hasn't been the case for a large part of the tourism industry, which ecotourism is. It's in the tourism industry. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of important to remember when thinking about this as an alternative development model, is like it's still tourism to a certain extent. It's still relying on foreign currency and relying on foreign investment to a certain extent to prop up the economy. And with that, I'm kind of curious about how this factors into the broader conversations taking place right now about multipolarity and taking kind of alternative options in foreign policy and in foreign investment. And you mentioned a little bit earlier about Venezuela, Petrocaribe, and China as well, and kind of how these new actors can potentially challenge the hegemony of the United States in tourism, in the economy, and in these industries and in investment in the Caribbean. So yeah, I'm curious about kind of contextualizing this with the broader conversations on multipolarity, kind of the changing nature of US hegemony, and whether these are viable options that can both preserve like sovereignty and alternative development and definitely protect the economy, the environment as a primary goal.
Right. Well, thinking about multipolarity, interestingly enough, CBI, which is a controversial, it's called Citizenship by Investment. It's a controversial policy, but it's basically, trying to create investment by like essentially like foreign entities to kind of go in and like become citizens of the country and invest in, and that money can be then funneled into more infrastructure projects. So that's basically what Dominica also does, which is an alternative form of development in a sense, because again, de-risking or delinking, I'm not sure the correct terminology, but specifically the ways in which American banks have, withdrew a lot of times from the Caribbean in the post-global recession of 2008. So just that's also made a lot of Caribbean islands to seek to get currency or, in terms of investment from China or from these alternative sources, because again, because of the nature of global capitalism and its unsustainability, it's kind of been, disproportionately punished, the global South in particular. So just thinking about it in that sense, I do think geopolitics is important in this. I was thinking about Eugenia Charles, whose foreign policy became very much aligned with Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And in particular, Dominican's foreign policy, they recognized Taiwan over the People's Republic of China until the Labor Party came back into power. So when the Labor Party came into power, they did recognize People's Republic of China, and how that alone kind of opened up a different kind of relationship that they could have. And I do think when I'm thinking about Haiti, for instance, the ways in which the US leverages its authority over Haiti, some would say that Haiti has basically become a colony of the United States, in terms of making sure that they don't recognize the People's Republic of China, and just how infrastructural development projects had not even pursued in Haiti because of that dynamic. So there's definitely the ways in which the US can still try to leverage its hegemony against the internal affairs, and how that can, and how multipolarity then could be a counter to that, but it's complicated because of the ways in which the US has these very toxic relationships with islands that it has deep, deep histories of meddling in.
Absolutely. And I think that leads to, I guess, my last question, which is about like how to square all of these efforts for protecting sovereignty and alternative forms of development with a broader kind of initiative of kind of a pan-Caribbean unity that emphasizes, overcoming the individual kind of like histories and dispositions of the different island nations, and bring them together in uniting the Caribbean and working collectively. And so you have like, it's hard to imagine that you have simultaneously kind of pan-Caribbean unity that is led by Dominica and Eugenia Charles, that is very much in favor of the United States, and then kind of a more progressive model, something like CARICOM, which I wonder, like, how progressive this body can be, and how much it's kind of pushed back against US imperialism or foreign imperialism, and also how it can potentially serve as a future model. Maybe it's not perfect, but can be a future model for a more kind of united economic and foreign policy initiative on behalf of the entire Caribbean in totality. So yeah, I'm curious about how this all fits in with CARICOM as an organization, and what you make of it, and kind of what its role will be in a future pan-Caribbean unity, and kind of preserving these important things we've talked about, like sovereignty and protecting the environment as well.
Well, I always go back, in terms of chronologically, to the West Indian Federation, 1958. It fell apart in 1962, and it had a lot of support on the ground, absolutely, in terms of the Commonwealth Caribbean. But I will say that, when these top-down structures, I think it's important to realize that, there are things like, class contradictions. And I think that in the terms of, you think about the post-independent Caribbean, things like managerial class, in terms of their interests superseding maybe a pan-Caribbean socialist vision, things like that relate to, again, the question of national sovereignty, independent sovereignty. Can CARICOM as a regional bloc kind of leverage its authority over Haiti, or what, the Haitian kind of internal affairs, or Dominican internal affairs? What role does it play in terms of, carving out the idea of national sovereignty within this kind of regional body? And I think that when it comes to, how I would approach it as a Marxist, I love like pan-Caribbean socialism, like that's great. But when you look into the history, it becomes a bit more complex, and specifically, in terms of, why isn't there more integration, and how can that be achieved? But I will say that I do think, as Maurice Bishop envisioned the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States kind of being a regional bloc to be able to assert itself against the US hegemony and Western sabotage, I do think that's very inspiring. And I'm definitely supportive of CARICOM and their reparations demand. It's inclusive, it's intersectional, and I do think that I like their principles of non-interference. In terms of, we were talking about, I was thinking about in terms of Russia and the war in Ukraine, and how, a good amount of members abstained from removing Russia from the Human Rights Council. So it can still kind of leverage its kind of like independence from the US dominated foreign policy positions, even though prior it didn't, in particular in terms of the invasion, but it still shows the ways in which, it can sway, it can leverage its authority in terms of, maybe opposing a coup attempt in Venezuela, things like that. So I do think CARICOM is very important, and I do hope for deeper integration.
Absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned too, the CARICOM reparations initiative, it is something that I think is like definitely should be watched very closely, because that's like very important initiative. And as you mentioned as well, to kind of trace this back to Maurice Bishop and his ideas in the New Jewel movement of promoting Pan-Caribbean unity, which definitely would have, been a useful role in preventing the U.S. Intervention that ultimately overthrew the New Jewel movement. And it's unfortunate, I think, to think like in the final analysis of how the U.S. uses these islands against one another, and even in reading about, and as we talked about with Operation Red Dog, it's like you're reading about people talking about how to use Dominica against Grenada in this way that is reminiscent of divide and conquer mentality under imperialism.
And there's the ways in which funneling so much funding into these opposition parties so that they have a chance to win also, and be able to kind of enact these policies that further U.S. objectives. So.
Absolutely. And yeah, that electoral meddling, I think people don't really grasp like how much of an impact that has. And even when you were discussing kind of the recognition of Taiwan, I mean, that's kind of a critical diplomatic like position that does have a huge role in investment and in choosing alternative options that is really dependent on which party is in power. So yeah, the US meddling kind of extends all the way from this kind of electoral influence to the more over the top kind of intervention that occurred. So thank you so much. And I guess the last thing would be any book recommendations that you have that people should read to learn more about this subject. Go for it.
Yes. Okay, so quite a few. So this is In Search of Eden, Essays on Dominican History. And it's by Irving Andre and Gabriel Christian. It's kind of hard to find, but if you can find it, it's very, very big. But there's so much history, specifically around Dominican labor history, communist history, Marxist-Leninist history. It goes all into that. It's very good for finding out its radical past. I love that. And then also, I'm currently reading Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment by Yormar Bonilla. And this is also a great book because I'm thinking right now about the French presidential elections in Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guyana. Kind of goes into the question of like, what does national sovereignty look like and the roles in which they have in carving out their own autonomy. So that's relevant. And currently also women and tourist work in Jamaica. This really goes into the feminizing of the tourist industry in particular. I know there's a lot of Marxist sex work questions, so it kind of gets into the sex trade, sex tourism, but it's also fascinating to show the ways in which, which populations are disproportionately harmed by the unsustainability of the tourist industry. So this is a good one. So yes, that covers it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Those all look really great. And also, especially with non-sovereign futures, as you mentioned, like, yeah, the French election kind of just happening and Marine Le Pen getting, the protesters, the anti-fascist protesters she encountered in Guadeloupe, like that's kind of still a lot of people don't know those are departements of France, like overseas departments. So
they call them militant blacks. So
yeah, that's very on brand for her. And I'm sure Macron's response was no better. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking more. And I learned a lot still, and I'm learning a lot about Dominica, and this history is really fascinating as well. As you mentioned with the first book, In Search of Eden, the kind of untapped history of Marxism, Leninism in Dominica. That's kind of what we're really interested in, pretty much like in our group, is just learning more about Marxism, Leninism in places in the global South that it hasn't been written about. So, that might be a book that our reading group gets to sometime. So yeah, thanks so much. And we really appreciate it.
All right, goodbye.
Bye.